Hello and welcome. I am Deanne Emery and I will be the facilitator for this webinar today. Our presenter is Melanie Ross. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar entitled Using Internal Audits for Process Improvement. Please note that we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for viewing on our website in the future. Some logistics before we get started. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer your questions. I'd like to tell you a little about our presenter today. Melanie is the technical products developer for ANAB and has over 20 years experience in quality control and quality assurance. She has experience in a variety of fields, including chemical, biological, food, oil and gas, and aerospace. She is also a lead assessor for numerous conformity assessment standards. So Melanie, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you now.
Thank you, Deanne, and welcome everyone. Before we get started, I just want to go over a brief disclaimer related to this webinar. So this webinar is not guaranteed to provide you all of the information that you need to know about internal audits or to prepare you for any kind of application for accreditation. We leave it up to you to determine how you use the information that's presented in this webinar today as you improve your processes at your laboratory or at your organization, and as you go on your journey for accreditation. Any examples that we provide are for illustrative purposes only, and just to facilitate the understanding of the concepts discussed. We're not providing templates or prescriptive models or representations of any kind of compliance with any specific standard. And you'll see as we go through the presentation today that some of the examples that I use for requirements are general and they can be applied across many different standards. With that, we will go ahead and get started in our content. For our key takeaways today, we want to provide you with an understanding of how to set clear audit objectives, audit criteria, and that audit scope. You can begin to develop tools to use with your internal audit findings for process improvement, and how to use your internal audits to feed the continuous improvement cycle. Oftentimes, we're required to perform internal audits by our standards that govern our management system, but those internal audits can really be used for a lot of different purposes within the organization for continuous improvement, for process improvement, and for educational purposes as well. And then finally, we want to talk about how to link our internal audit results to other aspects of the organization's management system. And we'll see as we get into that, we're looking at other operations within the organization, such as our management review, competence of personnel, and a lot of different areas that can tie into our internal audits to leverage those results, again, for that process improvement or continuous improvement. Before we begin, I think it's important that we define what is an audit, and the definition for audit comes to us from ISO 9000-2015. It is a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining objective evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. So you can see in this definition, objective and objectively are both used. Our internal audits should be an objective process based on evaluating requirements, which is that audit criteria, versus actual practice. We talk about systematic, meaning that there is a process for those internal audits. When we talk about independent, we want the internal auditors to be independent of the areas that they are auditing to get a fresh set of eyes and to remove bias from that internal audit. What we're talking about in our webinar today is what is called first-party audits. We're looking at the organization from a first-party perspective. Our internal auditors are internal to the organization, or they're contracted depending on the number of personnel and the availability of resources at your organization. There are other types of audits, and they are second-party and third-party audits. The second-party audits are looking at an organization from an outside perspective, such as a customer of yours or your organization, or you going out to do an audit of a supplier or a vendor or a subcontractor. When we look at those third-party audits, those are from the third-party perspective. It is either an accreditation or certification audit or a regulatory audit. But when we're talking about internal audits, we're looking at it from that first-party perspective. There are a lot of different purposes for internal audits. I think the main one that's not even listed here is to conform to requirements. So we have specific requirements that are on our organization, whether voluntary, mandatory, or determined by our customers, that we must complete those internal audits to fulfill some requirement within a standard. But more importantly, internal audits serve a much greater purpose when leveraged for continuous improvement. Obviously, our internal audits can provide objective feedback on processes. They can tell us how that process is performing based on the written procedure and based on the requirements of the process. Internal audits also identify gaps between those requirements and the actual practice of the organization or of that process. They can identify inefficiencies. So if we look at those gaps, maybe those gaps are nonconformities or areas where things are lacking, but it can also identify where we may be inefficient in those internal audits, or in our processes, sorry. Internal audits can also highlight best practices. I like to bring this one up when we're talking about internal audits, because oftentimes when we're looking at our processes, we're only looking at what is going wrong. If we start looking at our internal audits from what we're doing right, it can give a different spin on those internal audits. And also, those best practices can be leveraged within the organization for other areas in the organization. So if you're doing an internal audit of one department and they're doing something that is very efficient and very process-oriented and improvement-oriented, that might be something that other areas within the organization could benefit from and learn from. They also guide process improvements. That's the title of our webinar today, is using internal audits for process improvements. So when we look at our internal audits and we look at the results of those audits, those can provide us a roadmap, so to speak, on how to implement process improvements or what improvements should be implemented. I said at the very beginning of that last slide that we have requirements for internal audits as organizations, whether we are accredited or certified, or it is only a voluntary thing that we would like to meet specific requirements for internal audits. And those requirements are similar across many different standards. So many different ISO conformity assessment standards, as well as ISO management system standards. So when we're looking at the requirements for internal audits, in the context of this webinar, we're looking at the general requirements laid out for organizations on what they should be doing for internal audits. And on a very basic level, you should conduct internal audits at planned intervals to provide information on whether your management system does specific things. The first one is, does it conform to your own requirements? Those are internal requirements held within your procedures or your policies of management, those requirements that are set by your organization. Then we're also looking at conformance to requirements of the standard, whichever standard that is. That could be ISO 9001 or ISO 14001, ISO IEC 17025, or any of the other hundreds of ISO standards that are out there that can govern our management systems and our conformity assessment activities. Then the second step is we want to make sure that our management system is effectively implemented and maintained. So when we're looking at these requirements, there's really 3 steps. In our internal audits, we are evaluating implementation of our management system. We're evaluating conformance of that management system to requirements, whatever those requirements may be. And we're evaluating, is it maintained effectively? So you want to keep that in mind, whether you're planning internal audits or you are performing internal audits, that these are really our goals for our internal audits. They may not be our audit objectives, but they should be the underlying tone of your internal audits, of going in to verify conformance, to verify implementation, and to ensure that your management system remains in place and maintained effectively. When we go back to different types of audits, there are many different types of audits that you could perform as part of your internal audit program. And I don't want to go too deeply into the different types of audits as part of this webinar, but I do want to bring your attention to the different ways that you may be looking at your organization as part of your internal audit program. And it may not even be something that you have thought about before, but it is something to consider to ensure that your internal audits are effective. So we look at different types of audits from what we are evaluating. Are we looking at the management system, or are we looking at the technical operations? Now, some may argue technical operations are a part of that management system, and I would agree with you. The management system encompasses the business. It encompasses the work that is being performed. When we're talking about technical operations, that's more getting into observing processes, method witnessing, so to speak, and looking at the technical aspect of the operations, technical aspects of the procedures that are being performed. It's going a little more deeply into method validation and verification, into that metrological traceability, or just traceability of your processes in general. When we're looking more at the management system, we're looking at a holistic picture of all of those pieces that fit together, like document control, record control, personnel requirements, those sorts of things. While we do look at that for technical operations, it may not be as deep a dive into the technical aspects of the organization when you're looking at a management system audit versus a technical operations. And oftentimes those are combined. So they're all in one in an internal audit. You're going from start to finish, looking at management system requirements and those technical operations. And then I want to say the depth that you go in those internal audits really depends on your goals within your audit program and what you want to achieve with those internal audits. If you are just looking for conformance to requirements of a standard to perform your audits, they may just be a checkbox exercise that doesn't really provide much value to the organization. So you really want to look at how can you leverage your internal audits to ensure that you are improving processes and identifying any issues that may occur along the way. Then when we look at the right bubble on this slide, we look at horizontal versus vertical audits. And again, I don't want you to get tripped up too much on the different thought process behind these two audits. But when we're looking at horizontal audits, we're looking across the organization or across a department. So we're focusing again on that holistic picture across different processes rather than one process itself. When we're looking at a vertical audit, that's when we take that deep dive. So that may be that method witnessing or observation of a process being performed, is you're diving straight down into that process and you're not looking left or right. You're going up and down within that process to do a full internal audit. Now, again, just like with the left side, our internal audits may be a combination of both horizontal and vertical. And when we think about internal auditing and having an audit plan, maybe those vertical parts of the audit are some of those audit trails or audit tracing that we're doing within our internal audits. So again, those management system audits are going to evaluate your management system to determine conformance to requirements. When we look at those technical operations audits, it's more thorough of a verification of processes, including any controls to ensure validity of results, or if you're looking at it from a management system perspective, to ensure validity of the products that are being manufactured or of the processes within the organization that are a part of your goals and products, processes, and services that your organization is providing. And then again, just to hammer the point home with horizontal versus vertical audits, horizontal may be one process across many departments or functions. Maybe your organization is having some issues with document control, and so you do a special horizontal audit on document control and look at that process across many different departments or across the whole organization. It also can be following that process from start to end. So coming in from receiving all the way out to product going out the door or a report going out the door with data on it. And then when we look at that vertical audit, it could be all processes within a department or looking up and down within that department or that function. Now that we have an idea of what types of audits we can perform, we're going to look at our internal audit program planning. We want to arrange our internal audits to contribute to the objectives of the organization. You might say that's a very vague statement, and it is, but the goal here is to look at our internal audits as a tool for the organization to ensure that we're meeting objectives. So those internal audits, we don't want to perform them in a vacuum. We want to have a purpose for those internal audits. Again, it's to look at conformance to requirements and that implementation and maintenance, but it's also a very good mechanism to look at how are the objectives being achieved within the organization. And then on the flip side of that, it can look at, are those objectives relevant to the management system and to continuous improvement within the organization as well. There are many different methods that we can use to achieve those internal audits, to evaluate our objectives and to meet our audit objectives. And those involve human interaction and some that are quote unquote no human interaction. I don't know that there's ever anything we do in an internal audit that requires absolutely no human interaction, but let me explain what the two of them mean and it might make a little more sense. Human interaction, the biggest function that we can do in internal audits is interview personnel. That provides us with objective evidence based on the information provided by the interviewee. We plan for those interviews and prepare our questions in order to gather the objective evidence. Now, when I say interview, it doesn't necessarily mean sitting in a conference room, one person on one side of the table and the other person on the other. It may be more fluid than that. You may be performing an internal audit and walking through an area and asking the person walking you through what it is that they do. How do they know what their process is? Where is their procedure? What records do they generate? That sort of thing can also be an interview that's less formal. That human interaction can also be completing checklists, sitting down with individuals that are subject to the internal audit and writing out conformance to requirements based on that checklist of requirements. We use sampling within our internal audits, and I've already mentioned observation of work, which may include witnessing. We designate the difference between observation and witnessing in that observation is just the act of watching. So you're watching the work being done. You're walking through the area and you're observing facilities and environmental conditions. When we look at witnessing, that's where we get into more of that technical internal audit, where we're looking at the equipment that's used, the traceability of controls, all of those things that go into that technical aspect of the process being audited. Now, when we look at that no human interaction, we can look at document review and record review. So specifically on internal audits, typically we have access to the documents and records that are generated on the day-to-day operations. So we as internal auditors can go in and review those documents ahead of time or during the audit, as well as take a look at those records without actually interacting with anyone within the organization, just for the review. Now, the review may come up with other questions that you then follow up on through interviewing or through observation and witnessing, but the review itself can be done pretty much with no human interaction. And that goes the same for analyzing data, which we could argue that goes into that record review as well. And then we have completing checklists on the right-hand side as well, because some of the checklist information can be completed without that human interaction. So just be aware that your internal audits are going to be a blend of your auditors gathering information on their own and evaluating that information and confirming that information with that human interaction during your internal audits themselves. One of our objectives for our webinar today was to talk about setting audit objectives. We want to make sure that we are defining what is going to be accomplished. Now, this setting audit objectives may be a formal process, maybe something that you go over as part of your audit program, but it can also be individual to the internal auditor. So you know what audit you're assigned to, what are your objectives for the audit, what would you like to accomplish as part of this internal audit. So it can be that overall program, which may be to complete all of our internal audits on time, to ensure conformance to requirements at a rate of such and such %, or it may be each individual audit and unique to the auditors performing the audit. When we set objectives or goals, we want to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. And that's that SMART goal or SMART objective. We want to clearly state our goal or our objective. What does it mean for success? So if we say we want to evaluate conformance and establish conformance to a specific percentage, right? That's measurable. Is it accomplishable? Do you have the resources in order to accomplish that goal or to achieve that objective? And then make sure that your audit objectives are aligned with your audit program and aligned with your overall objectives of the organization. And then obviously timely, you set a time period for when you would like to accomplish those audit objectives. Now, this may be something that you do formally as part of your internal audit program, or it may be something that you perform a little less formally and just have a general idea of what you want to accomplish for your internal audits. But I encourage you to set audit objectives that talk about continuous improvement. So we want to feed our continuous improvement process with our internal audits. Okay, that's a very general objective. So what would you call success? Do you get 3 improvements out of it? Does every audit relate to a continuous improvement? Do you use your lessons learned as part of feeding into the next internal audits? So just consider setting some audit objectives that focus on that continuous improvement effort within the organization. These are just some examples of audit objectives, and these come from the guidelines for management system audits. One of them, the most common, is determination of extent of conformity with audit criteria. The other one can be evaluation of the capability of the management system to assist in meeting relevant requirements. That one's a little vague. We probably would need to put some more parameters around that to say, what does that capability look like and what measures can we have to measure that capability? Then obviously our internal audits evaluate the effectiveness of the management system in meeting our intended results. So our management system may be set up to operate us as a testing laboratory or a calibration service provider? Is that management system effective in order to meet those objectives of the organization? And then identification of opportunities for potential improvement. Those are really what we're looking for in our internal audits, whether we're looking at nonconformities or looking at areas of the organization that there may be gaps or there may be inefficiencies. That's where we're looking at our internal audits to provide that information to us in order to improve the organization. The evaluation of suitability and adequacy of the management system with respect to the context and strategic direction. This is where we're tying our internal audits to the objectives and to the strategy of the overall organization. And then this last one, evaluation of the capability of the management system to establish and achieve objectives and effectively address risks and opportunities. Now, again, these are not SMART objectives. These are just examples of where you could start in setting those audit objectives and then putting those SMART parameters around it to make sure that it is relevant and timely, that you can achieve it, and that there is some sort of measure behind that objective as well. When we're looking at the audit scope, this is when we're starting to look at each individual audit or one audit if that's what you're performing as part of your internal audit program. We want to make sure that our audit scope or scopes is consistent with our audit program and our audit objectives. So if our audit objectives are to ensure that the management system and technical operations conform to requirements, then we want to make sure that those audit scopes include technical operations. So our scopes can include those locations that are going to be a part of the internal audit. That may be physical locations like buildings or cities or states, but it may also be departments. It may be where in the building are we going to be doing the audit? Are we going where the work is being performed, or are we doing the audit in a conference room? We talk about the functions that are going to be audited. Are we auditing purchasing, or are we auditing the technical operations, and what's included in that? What activities are going to be audited? So is it incoming, receiving, and inventory, if we're talking about purchasing or something like that? We get down to the processes. This is the SOPs, the work instructions, the documentation that governs the area within that audit scope that's going to be a part of the audit. And then we want to define that time period that we're going to cover. Are we looking at records or documents or activities from the last internal audit to this internal audit, or the first quarter of the year or half the year? Defining that time period assists in ensuring that we are gathering enough objective evidence as part of the audit to, one, determine that requirements have been met, so determine conformity or nonconformity if it exists, but also to guide our auditors to ensure that they understand what it is that they are supposed to be auditing. Our audit scope sets our boundaries for our audit. It talks about where we're going to go, where we're not going to go, what processes are a part of this internal audit and what are not. It contains that specificity about the depth of the audit. So you may be talking about, are we doing a horizontal or vertical audit? Is this a management system or a technical operations audit? And then again, it's dependent on those audit objectives. They fit together. If your audit scopes don't fit with your audit objectives, then you're not going to meet those objectives as part of your internal audit program. I've used the word audit criteria a couple of times, but we do have to define that audit criteria. And the audit criteria is the requirements that are laid out for the area that's being a part of the internal audit. So again, that audit criteria may be an ISO standard, specific clauses within an ISO standard. It may be requirements set on you by your customers or by regulations. It may be those internal requirements as well. So our audit criteria is what we use as a reference against which conformity is determined, or if nonconformity exists. Again, those audit criteria, getting more specific into it, can be our policies, any processes, whether those are process flows or electronic processes, any of our procedures, performance criteria, work instructions, legal or regulatory requirements, and other management system requirements that may be a part of your management system that are not defined in any specified requirements, such as a standard or a procedure. I want to point out that performance criteria. This is where you can get into tying your internal audits to your organizational objectives and your key performance indicators. You can include those performance criteria as part of your audit criteria in order to verify if those performance criteria have been met. Now, not to say that you have to do that as part of your internal audits. Some organizations have other mechanisms to evaluate performance criteria or key performance indicators, and that's perfectly fine. What we're saying is if you think of your internal audits as a holistic approach for process improvement, looking at those performance criteria or performance indicators will assist you in bringing together your internal audits as a tool for your organization to implement continuous improvement within your organization. And then this just further outlines those audit criteria in specifics. So I've already talked about customer requirements, like regulatory requirements, those standard requirements, your internal policies and procedures, any quality plans, production plans, project plans. Anything is fair game as far as what your audit criteria is. Now, with that said, you don't want to go too overboard and overwhelm yourselves with the criteria on your internal audit. You want to think about meeting those audit objectives. What's your goal for your internal audit, and what parts of these requirements make sense to include in your internal audit program as part of your audit criteria? So here's just a simple example of an audit scope and audit criteria. So we have the audit scope is purchasing. Our audit criteria is the 17025 standard, the 9001 standard, our purchasing procedures, contract requirements, and those key performance indicators for purchasing. Now, I would go one step further with these audit criteria, and I would define what clauses of those two standards are relevant. I would also put in the actual procedures. What procedures are we going to look at? Now, does this have to be a formal document? Not necessarily. It does assist with your internal audits and with the auditors if it is a formal document, but it's not required to be. It's having a general understanding of what should you look at as an internal auditor when you are performing that audit to ensure that it's comprehensive and that you're tying together those procedures with the requirements with the actual practice. So we write our procedures based on requirements, and then we implement. Where we can find issues with that implementation is actually observing the work being performed and interviewing the personnel to see, so the procedure matches requirements, but what we do in practice, does that really meet requirements? And that's where a lot of process improvements can come into play with your internal audits. We come to our audit findings. When we look at that audit criteria, the requirements, we look at our audit evidence, which is what we're gathering throughout the internal audit through observation, through our checklist, document review, the interviewing, all of those practices with that human and no human interaction. We're combining those two and comparing them to determine if there's conformity or non-conformity. So I always like to point out that our internal audit findings can be positive, which is that conformity, or they can be negative, which is that non-conformity. Again, I said earlier on, we want to identify those best practices within our internal audits. So we want to consider talking about that conformity and not just pointing out all the areas where things are going wrong. Our internal audit findings need to be based on evidence observed during our internal audit. That evidence is verifiable. So it's records, it's documents, it's observing the process, evaluating those records for completeness, making sure that we're comparing those records to the processes, to the requirements. That evidence is going to be key in using our internal audits for continuous improvement as well. So here's where we see that positive and negative. Our nonconformity is a non-fulfillment of a requirement. So it could be that, that you are not meeting requirements because you were unaware of the requirement, or it could be that you're not meeting requirements because a process changed. That nonconformity, while I say it's negative, it's not a negative thing. We want to identify nonconformities in our internal audits because that gives us the opportunity to fix them, to implement actions in order to eliminate the cause of that nonconformity so that we can improve our processes. Those positive findings are the good practices within the organization that can act as lessons learned either in the area being audited or across the organization. And then that middle box is any area where you may be meeting requirements, but you could do it better. Internal audits often come up with a lot of opportunities for improvement, including those that feed into your continuous improvement cycle. So I caution you to think about those audit objectives when you are creating your opportunities for improvement. Would this opportunity for improvement add value to the organization? Is it necessary to avoid a nonconformity? And is it something that would benefit the organization? Again, our positive findings are those good practices. It says implemented by the laboratory, but that can be organization too. It doesn't just have to be a laboratory. It can highlight the strengths of the area that you are doing the audit on. And it can be positive comments on competence and conformity, or it could be a kudos to that department being audited. As an internal auditor and a quality manager, I liked to point out those positive findings to let everyone know where they are conforming. And that way, when there is nonconformity, they feel empowered to correct that nonconformity and turn it into a positive finding, either for that next internal audit or for an external assessment as well. When we look at our findings for process improvement, we want to evaluate if our nonconformities are systemic. Are they related just to the scope of that audit, or are they potentially issues that could be across the organization? Again, those audit findings can be lessons learned for other departments or other processes. One of the things that you may see on your internal audits is you audit one department under one audit and audit scope, and you go into a different department and you find the same issue. So if you're finding the same nonconformity or the same opportunity for improvement in one audit versus the other, that can point to your overall internal audit program not being used as a tool for continuous improvement. If you take a look at your internal audit findings from a higher level and say, is this something that is across the organization, and how can we as an organization correct this problem, implement corrective actions, then you would only find it once and your organization would be improved based on those actions taken from that audit finding. Our audit results should be input into the analysis aspect of our business planning. Again, sometimes our internal audits are a siloed activity where we are performing them as quality personnel and they are not being fed back into that business planning. Now, are you required to do that? Absolutely not. There's no requirement for that in the standard, but the more you incorporate your internal audits into your organization as a business activity, the more value they're going to add to your organization. And again, it can identify improvement needs and the activities that may be needed to implement those improvements as well. Part of our improvements or continuous improvement cycle is looking at the effectiveness of our audits. So we can establish audit effectiveness criteria. We can monitor and measure the implementation of our audit program in specific on an ongoing basis to ensure that our objectives have been achieved. We take a look at the audit program to see are there any needs for change and possible opportunities for improvement within the audit program itself. So while our audits can feed the continuous improvement cycle for the organization as a whole, we also want to be looking at our internal audits as a process of the organization and say, can those be improved as well? We can review the overall implementation of the audit program, identify those areas and opportunities for improvement, apply any changes that we need, review any professional development of our auditors. Is there additional training that they could use to make them more valuable as auditors to the organization? And we can review the results of our internal audits. Have we had several internal audits in a row that we've had no findings, no nonconformities, no positive things listed? Are our internal audits adding value? And one of the big things on this one is apply changes to the audit program. So you may set up your internal audit program to look one way when you set up your management system. It does not have to stay that way. You can improve your audit program. You can change the way that you're performing your internal audits, as long as it's not something you've written into your management system that you can't change it. You can always take a look at those audits and say, okay, we've been doing horizontal audits for a long time. Maybe for the next couple, we do vertical, or we're lacking on our technical operations audits. Maybe we should focus on those. So just keep that in mind as you're doing your audit planning from year to year. Additional considerations for your audit programs and applying changes to that audit programs is looking at the results and trends from monitoring your audit program, looking at how many nonconformities, how many positive findings, how many opportunities for improvement. Taking a look, are you following your own processes? Are you following those procedures that you have documented for your internal audit program? And then is there any need or expectation of a relevant interested party? Do you have a new contract with a customer that requires specific internal audits? Are there other requirements of your customers for those internal audits as well? Obviously, we're looking at the audit program records. You could look at alternative or new auditing methods, including the evaluation of auditors. So I talked about that. We set it up one way to begin with, and now we're going to look at it a different way and perform our audits in a different way. You can look at the effectiveness of the actions taken to address risks and opportunities. So we're taking those internal audit findings and feeding them into our corrective action process, which also goes into our risk process. What is the effectiveness of those actions that we've taken? And then we're always considering confidentiality and information security within our audits. And then what has been initiated into our corrective action process? Are we following up on those internal audit findings? Are they being used as a mechanism to improve the organization and to improve the operations? When we talk about using our internal audits for continual improvement, we want to look at lessons learned after each audit. These can be related to the audit program, or they can be related to the area that was being audited. So the audit findings that were generated out of that internal audit. We also look at auditor performance to improve our own performance as internal auditors. One of the auditor attributes is to be open to improvement. So we want to make sure that we are improving from audit to audit as well. And then again, we use those audit findings for improvements in other areas of the organization as well. I like to use the term lessons learned for our internal audits because they can be used to improve our audit program, but they can also be used to improve operations across the organization. So we want to take a look back at our internal audits and say, how did it go? Did we meet our audit objective? Did we stay within our audit scope? Did we find things that were value added to the organization as far as opportunities for improvement and nonconformities? And that feeds our continuous improvement cycle. We're continually improving the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of our management system by using these internal audit findings, the positives, the negatives, and the in-betweens, to ensure that we are conforming to requirements, that the management system is effectively implemented, and that we're maintaining that management system and making changes where necessary. These internal audits can also assist you in identifying and selecting opportunities for improvement and the implementation of any actions that may be necessary based on those opportunities for improvement. So this is where our internal audits feed into another area of our standards. A lot of different standards have a section on improvement. So one area that we can gather those opportunities for improvement is through our internal audit program. Our internal audits serve very many different functions. They can assist us in managing risk. Because of the inherent nature of internal audits, looking at requirements versus documentation versus practice, they can assist in improving operational efficiency and our internal control effectiveness. So if we have controls in place for a specific process, but we notice nonconformities in an internal audit, those controls may need to be modified. One of the biggest things for internal audit is ensuring that conformance to requirements, and it can act as a governance piece within the organization as well. We want to link our internal audits to our management system. So during internal audits, when we're interviewing personnel and reviewing records, we can evaluate that personnel competence, the adequacy of the equipment, the traceability, etc. If we're doing a technical audit, we could verify method validations and verifications. And then I've already mentioned comparing those audit results with any applicable key performance indicators that are relevant to the scope of the audit. And then the big one is to discuss the outcome of our internal audits during management review. This is a requirement for the management review to evaluate or to review those internal audit findings or internal audit results. But we want to make sure that we're value added with that review and that it's tying into other aspects of the organization, again, to feed that continuous improvement cycle. Our goal of internal audits is to provide feedback on our processes, to identify gaps between our requirements and practices, identify those inefficiencies, to highlight those best practices, and to guide process improvement. So we're coming back full circle to look at the goals of internal audits from a process improvement perspective. These 5 boxes could assist in defining your internal audit objectives. What would you like to achieve with those internal audits? And ultimately, we want to use our internal audits to assess how well the management system is working. If it's working well, there may not be a driver for process improvement. If there are areas where it could be working better, that's where we feed those internal audit findings into our continuous improvement cycle in order to drive those process improvements through the addressing of those internal audit findings. We want to conduct our internal audits as learning opportunities and a source of improvement. So we can look at that from 2 different perspectives. Learning opportunities for the organization to improve processes across the organization, but also learning opportunities for our internal auditors as well. Our internal audits can be a diagnostic tool to enhance our quality, improve our technical competence, and to assist in minimizing risk. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Deanne to go over some additional resources to give you some time to put your questions into the Q&A.
Thank you, Melanie, for that informative and great presentation. We do have a few questions coming through, and we will get to those after I talk a little bit about our resources. ANAB has many different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management systems, and assessments. On the ANAB website, there are free webcasts on a variety of topics. These webcasts are 5 to 20 minutes long, depending on the topic, and can be viewed at any time. ANAB also has a blog page with a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standards requirements, and others. We are also giving monthly webinars. Finally, ANAB offers training in many areas, including internal auditing, standards, risk, and other topics. We offer both in-person and live online instructor-led training that include exercises and discussions related to the topic at hand. We also offer web-based self-paced training. All of these resources can be found on the ANAB website at anab.ansi.org. So now we're going to move on to the fun part, which are your questions. So Melanie, we do have questions here. Our first question is, are there any frequencies as per standard?
So that is a very good question, and I would say it depends. So most ISO standards don't tell you a frequency of when you need to perform your internal audits. There are some. The 17020 for inspection bodies does still have a frequency in there of every 12 months or once per year or something like that. Where that frequency would come into play as a requirement is from your certification body, your accreditation body, the regulatory authority. Those types of organizations are going to provide that frequency if relevant. The frequency also will come from you setting your audit objectives. What is the organizational requirement for frequency? What is your organizational landscape? How many departments? How many processes? How many products? How many methods? That sort of thing is going to guide you in how often you should do your internal audits. The other aspect of that is looking at it from a risk perspective. If there is more risk in a process, you may want to audit it more frequently than a process that has less risk in it. So I encourage you to take a look at the requirements that are that your organization is subject to, and then discuss it with your certification body or accreditation body to see if there are any requirements further than just performing those internal audits based on your own audit program.
Great, thank you. So I have another question for you that starts with a great statement. Hi, thanks for the valuable presentation. Crime scene investigators work in the field where control cannot be exercised as being carried out within a lab. So this leads to chances of deviation from written procedures to some extent. So how much flexibility should be for the auditors of crime scenes?
That is a very specific question. And again, I will encourage you to look at the requirements of any bodies that govern your certifications or accreditations. But from a general perspective, people are the variable. We are the ones that are variable. We can write the procedure down to meet the requirements, and it can be really well documented, and we can have really great training. But then when we're out doing the work, we may have to step to the right instead of step to the left. Silly example, but that's one example. So you do have to have some flexibility within that, but I would say that that would be written into your procedures for the process being audited. It would allow for certain, I wouldn't say deviations, but there's certain allowances for variability within the process depending on the situation that they're in. So that crime scene investigation is one that takes a lot of professional judgment in how they're going to perform the processes that they need to perform. And that may be built into your internal audits of that function, is looking at professional judgment. What is their expertise? What is their years of experience? What is the deviation? Is it a deviation that causes you to bring the results into question, right? If it's a deviation that's acceptable, then maybe it's something that's noted in the internal audit, but it's not something that is brought up as a non-conformity because it didn't impact the validity of the results that were being generated.
Okay, thank you. let's see, we have a question. What is the difference between OFIs, opportunities for improvement, versus preventive actions? Both terms are applied in RQMS, but it is often difficult to understand when one applies versus the other. Thank you.
Well, I would say that it also depends on how you're defining it. So you say it's applied in your management system, but how is it defined? And what's the intent behind each of those? So a preventive action is an action that you take to prevent a nonconformity from occurring. An opportunity for improvement is where you're performing a process or performing a function, and it could be done better. Right? So it may not result in a nonconformity. It may just be able to be done more efficiently. You may be able to meet your objectives more effectively with some improvements to the process. So there may not be an action that needs to be taken like a preventive action. It may be more of that just improving the process in general, as far as training or maybe tweaking a step from here to there in order to make it more clear on the individuals that are performing that process.
Thank you, Melanie. I have a question. Will audit confirmations be responded to should ICE choose to follow up on certificate renewal submissions?
Yeah, we're going to have to get some additional information on that one. The individual that submitted it, if you want to send an email to anab@anab.org, then we can look into if that's a question that we can address.
Okay, thank you. I didn't understand it, but I knew that you might. How can you set a percentage of conformity as part of an internal audit objective? Do you think a reduction in the number of nonconformities is a valid internal audit objective?
I feel like I'm answering every question this way, but it depends. If you set an audit objective of we are going to reduce our nonconformities to 3, and you were at 25 the year before, well, what are you going to do to get there? Are you just going to look the other way when there's a nonconformance, or are you implementing those continuous improvement aspects of the internal audit program to achieve that objective? That's where that SMART goal comes into play, is looking at how is it achievable? How are you going to get there? I caution organizations to set an objective of 0 nonconformities in our internal audit, because that's, 1, just not feasible, and 2, it defeats the purpose of the audit program. You want to be finding areas that need to be improved. That's part of our internal audits. We don't want to get through our audits and go, whew, we didn't have any nonconformities because we raced through it. The goal of those internal audits is to improve the organization.
Thank you. Should the results of the internal audit be used to create preventive actions? Similarly, should OFIs be used to create preventive actions?
Well, I'm a little confused on the word create preventive actions. A preventive action may be implemented as part of an internal audit finding. But I don't know that you're necessarily like taking one and making it the other. It really depends on what that opportunity for improvement is, whether prevention needs to be included in that, or if it's just improving a process based on a project plan or based on, some other type of activity that's going to improve that process.
Is it possible to perform an internal audit on a one-person laboratory?
It is possible. It's very difficult to remove bias if you are a one-person laboratory auditing yourself. I have seen it done where it is a laboratory of one person. In those instances, it might be beneficial to have an outside source come in and perform that internal audit. Not saying that is required by any means, We just want to have some independence in those internal audits. And the other reason beyond the bias and independence is you're getting another set of eyes looking at the work that's being done. And that's one of the other goals of the internal audit, is to look at it from a different perspective. And so if you're performing the work and doing the internal audit, while that may be necessary, depending on the context of your organization and resource availability, it's not really providing much value back into the organization as an internal audit function.
Thank you. Thank you. Can a single internal audit contain multiple standards such as NSF, GMP, or FSSC 22000 at the same time?
Absolutely. And I encourage you to incorporate multiple requirements into your internal audits where they apply. Like I said, a lot of the requirements across ISO standards are similar. So if you have multiple standards that govern your management system, you may be able to audit once for a requirement and it goes across all three, but there may be other requirements that you need to incorporate. So if you have an integrated management system, a multi-standard management system, then for sure you want to pull in those requirements that make sense to meet your audit objectives as part of your audit criteria.
What are the minimum criteria for someone to be an internal auditor?
That is dependent on several different things. One is your own internal requirements within your organization. What have you set as your requirements for your internal audits? The other is for your certification body, your accreditation body, or a regulatory authority if they have specific requirements. Otherwise, you really want your internal auditors to understand the processes for internal audits. So have taken an internal audit course, whether that's a fundamentals course or a standard specific course, and you want them to be curious, right? So you want them to be able to go out and ask questions, to look at the processes being performed and the objective evidence that they're gathering, and to be able to evaluate that objectively. So really it's unique to the organization and what they require. I've seen some organizations say we require external training from an ILAC signatory accreditation body. And I've seen some that say, as long as you perform an audit with somebody else first, then you can do your audits with us. So again, it's really just unique to what is your audit objectives? What are the goals of your audit program? And what do individuals need in order to assist in meeting those objectives?
Is it not recommended to base your internal audit on the ANAB ISO recertification audit?
I'm thinking.
Yeah. It's a good question.
So I'm just going to talk about this one part of it, the ANAB ISO recertification audit. So I'm assuming that you are accredited to a conformity assessment standard like 17025 or 17020. You can certainly use the requirements that ANAB has in place or your accreditation body has in place as part of your audit criteria. But taking that checklist that your assessor fills out for ANAB and plopping that into your internal audit and saying, we're good, we don't have to do anything else, is not the intent of the internal audits used as continuous improvement. So you can take the results of those assessments by your accreditation body or certification body as inputs into your internal audit program. So maybe you had one area of the organization that had a lot of nonconformities in your external assessment, then that would indicate a higher level of risk, and you may want to audit that area in more depth or in a different way or more frequently. So that's really where that's going to feed into your audit program. Those internal audits should be managed and performed by the organization, looking at the audit criteria, which is the requirements, the objective evidence, which is the records and documents, interviews, all of that, and then comparing those two to ensure that they match. And where they don't, that's nonconformity. Where they may but could be done a little better, that's an opportunity for improvement.
Thank you. Thank you. We do have some more. It is after 3 o'clock. Do we want to keep going, Melanie? I don't
I
know.
am available to keep going, and since this is
Okay.
being recorded, if anyone needs to drop off, just check the ANAB website in a few days and the recording will be there. But we'll
All
keep
right.
going as long as we have questions.
Okay. Are there any specific formats we need to follow for internal audits?
No, plain and simple. I mean, again, if your accreditation body, certification body, regulatory authority, or your organization says you must do it this way, then yes. But for the most part, it's up to the organization to determine how they're going to perform their internal audits, what the records are going to look like. Ultimately, the standard says to maintain records or retain records as evidence of implementation of the audit program and completion of the audits, paraphrasing. As long as you have that and you're meeting that requirement and that it's benefiting your organization, then that's all you would need.
All right. Can we set internal audit objectives outside the ISO 19011 example to check if risk is effectively managed in an organization?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any objectives that we talked about in this webinar today were just examples. You can come up with whatever audit objectives you want for your audit program, for your internal audits individually. I just encourage you to try to incorporate those or evaluate those in relation to your overall organizational objectives as well.
If you are verifying effectiveness of corrective actions from your quality system, should that be clarified in your internal audit scope?
Absolutely. If that's part of your internal audit is to evaluate effectiveness of actions taken from previous audits, for sure, you can put that in your scope.
Day by day, investigation is stepped up to the new type of crime scene so that the procedure may be violated at some instances. So how to manage this? How do we manage this to avoid through internal audits, or what percentage of deviations is acceptable?
That's going to be unique to your organization and to the audit objectives that you've set as part of your internal audit program.
What should we do after an internal audit?
Have a party? No, sorry. That's a very vague question. So in general, sorry, in general, what you would want to do is ensure that you have records as evidence that the internal audit program or the internal audit was performed, that information is in the hands of relevant management of the areas that were being audited, and that if there are any nonconformities, that they are followed up on and that they are addressed in some manner.
Thank you. This is a good one. With the increasing use of AI and automation, how do you see the role of forensic auditing evolving in the next few years?
I think that would be an excellent question to submit to ANAB at anab.org, and I can get that over to our VP of Conformity Assessment, who has written many different blog posts and done talks on AI and the future of AI in conformity assessment. And we will see if we can't get some conversation going there.
Do we need to close the findings and specific timeline for internal audits as per any standard?
There is no ISO standard that says that you have to finish your audit or complete your audit findings and corrective actions in a set period of time. Now, I've said it many times, maybe your AB or your CB or your regulatory authority has some sort of requirement. Maybe you've written something into your management system that is a requirement, but really it should be unique to the nonconformity and the actions that are needed. If you set a time frame of all corrective actions from internal audits are going to be closed in 30 days, and you have some capital expense you have to make to correct whatever is wrong, then you may not be able to meet that 30 days. So really you want to look at it from a risk perspective, from the severity of the nonconformity and what is reasonable in order to close out that nonconformity for internal audits.
It is believed that both the auditor and the auditee should agree and be on the same page as regards to audit findings for effective audit reports and conclusion. What would the auditor do in a case where the auditee doesn't agree or is uncooperative?
When we're looking at internal audits, I would encourage you to have some sort of process in place that talks about disagreements for nonconformities. There's no requirement to do that. But if you think about your accreditation assessment or your certification audit, the CB and the ABs have processes for appeals and processes for challenges of nonconformities. And if you formalize that to some degree in your organization to say it goes to management or it's discussed in management review or something like that, then that just assists in resolving those conflicts. On the other side of that, however, if your internal audit findings, your nonconformities are based on objective evidence, so there's a requirement, there's objective evidence, and this is where it's not meeting the requirement, then there really is no argument. It either is or isn't meeting that requirement.
ANAB mentions that the audit program should be based on risk levels. Can you give an example?
For sure, there's lots of different examples that we could use for risk levels. One is, how many times is the process performed? Is it a process that is performed over and over and over and over and over again, so people are very familiar with the process? Maybe that has less risk than a process that's performed once a year. We also can look at it on the flip side of that. If it's performed over and over and over again, more data is out in the marketplace, and that may be a significant risk. So it's looking at the processes and the impact of those processes to the organization, and that will really help guide those risk levels in looking at those internal audits.
Thank you. Are organizations required to demonstrate that each requirement of the standard has been audited?
I mean, yes and no, because the ISO standards say that your internal audits need to demonstrate conformance to requirements. It doesn't say each and every requirement. There may be some requirements that are a given that they're met. Maybe some of those in, clause 5 for organizational, you have an org chart, so you're not going to audit that every year, maybe. But you do need to show that your internal audits are comprehensive in evaluating your management system to ensure that it is effectively implemented and maintained.
We answered a similar question, but I'm going to ask this anyway. In regards to preventive action versus OFI, many companies use preventive actions when potentials for flaws or errors are found outside of an internal or external audit during the day-to-day activities. And then OFIs are typically given by an auditor during an internal or external audit.
That's a good way of looking at it. And that's the way that their organization has defined it. And so if your organization defines it that way as well, then that's one way to define those two different terms. As long as your focus is continuous improvement, and you can really call it whatever you want, as long as you're looking at ways to improve your processes, prevent nonconformities from occurring, and fixing those nonconformities that do occur.
Melanie, can you help define hybrid auditing?
I'm assuming hybrid auditing is meant like partially online and partially in person, or maybe partially human interaction, partially non-human interaction. If that's not the case, then provide clarification, and Deanne can provide that to me. But if you're doing a hybrid audit of some of it is online, some of it is in person, again, that audit plan is very important because you're going to define what areas of the audit are going to be done in which manner. So laying out your audit plan, your audit criteria so that it's clear, so that your audit objectives can be met by the time you're finished with that audit.
Thank you. Don? How are internal audits and management review meetings interrelated?
Well, for one, part of your management review requirements are to discuss the outcomes of internal audits. So that will provide information into your management review up to management about how many audits were performed, what were the, how many nonconformities, maybe what were the nonconformities, were audit objectives met, that sort of thing. And then on the other side of that, thinking about results of your management reviews. Is there an area that was identified in management review that may need improvement? Well, they may need an internal audit as part of that. So that's how they can feed back and forth to each other.
Is there a general standard to look for when auditing?
ISO 19011 is a guideline for the auditing of management systems, and it provides information on developing audit programs, auditor attributes, and auditor competence, knowledge, and skills, and as well as performing those internal audits. It's not a standard, so it doesn't have requirements. It's just a useful tool to take a look at your audit program and have some structure around it as well. As far as the standards, that would be part of your audit criteria. So it would be that 9001 or 17025 or other standards that govern your management system.
Is it possible to do an internal audit vertically, only excluding horizontal and activity witnessing?
I mean, it's possible to only do vertical audits. You may not get a comprehensive picture of the management system and those interrelations between processes, which is often where we find nonconformity, is where processes hand off from one to the other. I would say excluding activity witnessing, I would caution you on that, because specifically in 17025, laboratory activities need to be included in your internal audits. Now that could be done without witnessing, I suppose, but witnessing is a good exercise to provide valuable information about the processes being performed, and it also helps get those laboratory staff ready for their external assessments.
Which is better, planning quarterly department audits or yearly once internal audit covering all departments?
That depends. It depends on the objectives of your audit program, depends on the context of your organization, the number and complexity of processes that are being performed, and the number of internal auditors that you have available. So it has to be looked at from a resource perspective, a planning perspective, and an internal audit program perspective to determine what makes the most sense. And I said it earlier, you may start your internal audit program saying, we're going to do one audit quarterly covering a quarter of our requirements in each audit. You do that for a couple of years and then it's not working for you. So maybe then you change it up to something different. But there is no specified requirement in an ISO standard that says you have to do it this many times. Again, your AB, CB, or regulatory authority may have other requirements, so be aware of those when you are planning your internal audits.
That was the last question, Melanie, but there is one statement I want you to hear. It says, thank you, fantastic job by Melanie in presenting about internal audits, and moderation by Deanne. Have a great day. Cheers till next time.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for attending. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I believe internal audits can really fuel continuous improvement in the organization and can be an effective tool in ensuring that your organization has a continuous improvement mindset and that your management system continues to function effectively within the organization. So I appreciate you all coming and attending today.
As Melanie mentioned, you can get additional information on our accreditation services or any of your general questions at ANAB at anab.org. If you've got any additional questions about training, if you would like information on additional training or you can't find it on our website, please come to training at anab.org and we will answer you as soon as we can. We want to thank you so much for joining us today.